Hi, my name is Patricia Oliart. Greetings from the northeast of England, where I live. I'm a lecturer in Latin American Studies in Newcastle University. And for this opportunity, I would like to present an issue that maybe sound a bit odd, because we are used to think that children shouldn't work. We know that the world is not like that, but it is what I wanted to bring to the presentation today is an opportunity to reflect on an issue that is certainly a problem, but that has some nuances that is important to discuss, because it goes beyond the issue of working children. I wanted to tell you that the motivation for this talk was to tell you a story about a movement, a social movement of children in Latin America to protect their right to work. This came about because in 1989, there was a reformulation of the Declaration of the Rights of Child. I'm going to show you two articles that for these children became a contradiction. And so this is where we can start our discussion for today. The Article 32 of the Declaration of the Rights of the Child state that children need to be protected from economic exploitation and from performing any work that can be hazardous or to interfere with their education. And then some measures that governments needed to take. In some cases in Latin America, this was interpreted as that child work needed to be abolished, and a certain set of measures started being taken to abide by this article. But the Article 29, that is also in the same declaration, talks about the development of respect for the child's parents, his or her own cultural identity, language, and values. And this is something that the children's organizations of workers took into account to defend their right to work. Among the measures that some governments took was first the abolition of child labor in any form, the reinforcement of compulsory primary education, to close the education gap between rural and urban areas, and to close the gender gap between girls and boys in primary education. All of these part of the reality of many Latin American countries. There are children working not only in their communities, but also in the streets, in factories, some of them under really hard conditions, other work independently to contribute to their families, selling candies or shoe shining, etc. No, things that you may have seen in pictures or you have probably experienced if you've been to Latin America. The other thing was to reinforce, this was throughout the 1990s, compulsory primary education for children in all areas in the countries. There was a gap in rural areas in many countries. And in that decade, in the 1990s and the first 2 decades, so it's been 30 years now, Latin American countries at least guarantee that around 96, 97% of children in school age, at least for 1 or 2 years registered in a school. No? Of course, dropping of school is a recurrent problem. Schooling and cover is guaranteed, but permanence isn't, and nor is the quality of education. And so many times parents decide to remove their children from schools because they don't see any benefit coming out because of the low quality of rural education. Governments wanted to close the gap, and several measures were taken in those years. Retraining of teachers, refurbishing of schools, building of rural schools, improving roads to facilitate access to children to their schools, and a lot of incentives to stop girls from abandoning schools, because one of the characteristics in rural areas mostly, but among the poorest echelons in Latin American societies, is that girls abandon schools as soon as they start their period. So in between 11 or 12 years old, there is a massive dip in girls' attendance to school because of their own safety in many areas, or because parents don't want them to get pregnant, etc. So this is a very serious issue that is still going on. So all these measures were taken, but there was a very strong response to the first one. And the response came from child workers organizations in Latin America. There were associations of working children in Bolivia, Peru, Mexico, Ecuador, Colombia, Argentina, Venezuela, Paraguay, to name the most important ones. I'll send you a link to an article where there is a report on this issue. And they created these organizations of working children and adolescent boys and girls in 2016. And they wanted to make clear that they considered themselves part of the working classes. And as part of the working classes, so this was a working class movement conformed by children and adolescents, they wanted to defend their right to a dignified work. They asked the governments not to abolish child labor, but to protect children workers, no? By making sure that they were treated fairly, that they were protected from exploitation and abuse. And they introduced in the phrasing of the United Nations, this is very important, not the abolition of all kinds of labor, but the prevention of exploitation and abuse of children. So they were successful. And it was also something that had echoes in Africa and India, particularly, to protect the right of children and adolescents to a dignified work. No? And to comment on this situation, poverty certainly plays a part. No? Children need to work because what their parents make is not enough, or because they don't have families in many cases. They don't have parents to provide for them. There is an issue of migration, for example, when adults have to leave their homes to find work somewhere else, and it is the elder children who have to contribute to the house economy. There is a demographic growth, for example, in rural areas, and the shortage of land that expels younger families out of rural areas to migrate to urban areas where there are not enough well-paid jobs for everybody. There is also, you probably know these, Latin American countries are among the most unequal regions in the world, where levels of poverty are way below the poverty line, this affects mostly children. Over 30% of children under 15 in the region live under the poverty line. This is worse in some countries than in others, but this is more or less a global figure about the situation of working children. No? Also, something that is a general problem is that there are insufficient state services to take care for children who don't have the protection of the family or access to schools. Welfare services for children is not a well-developed area in the region. And so this leaves a lot of children unprotected and left to their own devices. So poverty is part of the problem, but there are other dimensions, mostly cultural dimensions, that I would like to discuss, just to think about how what we may be considering normal or a universal understanding of childhood does not apply to everybody. We just need to think that some of the considerations that are present in the Declaration of the Rights of a Child promulgated by the United Nations are rather new, are ways of understanding childhood that have barely a century in existence. You only have to think in Charles Dickens' novels, or here in England until the 1950s or 60s, a rite of passage for a boy to become a man started as soon as he was 12 or 13 years old, because it was the moment when they had to go to the mines to extract coal. So some of the ideas we have about what is adequate for children are rather new. And we have in our world cultures that are quite traditional and have a different understanding of childhood that we need to consider. No, I have this little slide here where I want you to compare the difference between traditional cultures and our contemporary culture. In traditional cultures, the belonging to the community is quite important. So traditional cultures tend to reinforce the belonging of children to the culture, to the community, by stressing the allegiance of values, ideological and cultural dependence, following the rules of the community. And this is done through everyday rituals, to rite of passage ceremonies, and to deep respect for the strong, for the family heritage. But at the same time, traditional cultures also stimulate, encourage the early economic and productive autonomy of their members, assigning gradual roles to children from when they are 2 or 3 years old to the reproduction of life, from watering plants, feeding some animals, herding animals from when they are very young, working the land. And all of these activities are quite important for the reproduction of everyday life, and also for learning, for the children to learn how to live in very difficult environments where, in order to survive, you need to be able to deal with the environment and to know basic tasks that allow you to be part of the family, but also learn about the environment and become a productive person. So there are traits in child rearing that are deeply linked to the environment and to the living conditions of these cultures that are quite different from the understanding that we can afford living in our contemporary societies that make us, for example, work to create autonomous individuals. The emphasis is in a child to find their own voice, to identify their particular traits, to encourage them to find this identity through writing, drawing, singing, many other activities that are there to enhance their development as a person, not necessarily as a productive person now. That is left to the future after we have raised them and educated them to become productive adults. So what we do is to stimulate independence from a very early age, and at the same time protect children and make them dependent while they are preparing to become productive adults. As you can see, these are very different approaches that in our society are not separate. That's the complexity of the situation we live in, because we have traditional families living in modern society, some of them practicing and needing these values for the raising of their children, but living in modern contemporary societies. This is interesting but problematic as well, because a mother or a father who encourages their children to develop skills, complex physical skills that demand work, are sometimes criticized by the other side, or perceived as negative by the children who live between cultures. No? So these are issues that I would like us to discuss when we meet and to think about, because this very simple separation, no? And description of different types of child rearing are at the basis of some kind of clash that parents and children from different cultures experience. So I would like to share with you some of the knowledge we have about what growing up in indigenous cultures mean, but it is also part of my fieldwork. Before coming to the UK, I was an anthropologist and I worked in rural education. So I visited schools in the Andes and in the Amazon region in Peru, where I am from, and could really see and experience the very diverse forms of raising children, but also the amazing amount of skills that children develop in difficult environments like the Amazonia, the Peruvian jungle, or the highlands. You know? So one first idea is that these environments play a crucial role in the upbringing and socialization of children, because they need to be competent in dealing with these areas. Fishing, for example, is a very important activity in the Amazon, in the rainforest. And children learn how to fish from a very early age. And I remember I once went to a village and there were only women and girls in the village. And one of the teachers who was visiting the village with me asked the mothers, where are the men? And she said, they have gone fishing. But there was this 16-year-old guy in a hammock. And so the professor, the teacher asked the same woman, and who is he? What is he doing? And she said, oh, he never learned to fish because he went to study high school. No, so he had been disabled by school, no, in this skill, and that got me thinking about this. No, the other thing is that this difficult environment in the Andes, but also in Guatemala and Mexico, where we have these very demanding mountains and lowlands, needs social cohesion. You can't survive on your own. You need to engage in a series of collective activities, for example, in the Andes, to maintain the soil fertility. You need to clean water channels. You need to clean the fields, take care of animals, but not each person taking care of their individual herds, but because sometimes they have to travel far away to get the pastures they need in different seasons, etc. So they need a lot of coordinated work that requires social cohesion. They need each other, and they need to be one collective will in order to survive. No? So this necessary sense of community has an impact in the way in which children are raised. They need to be involved with the family, with the community from a very early age. No? And they need to learn. They need to learn how to survive, how to produce their own clothing, for example. This is less and less common. People mostly buy their clothing or receive it by donations, etc., because it is so cheap to produce. But skills such as weaving are still a very important source of income because of tourism. No? So what was once a means to produce their clothing is now a means to get income because of tourism. So weaving is still very important for girls to learn. And in some cases for men as well. There are communities where the weavers are men. No? Or fishing, because this is like going to the market. No? And many people in the rainforest say the forest is our market, no? Our supermarket. And so learning how to fish is quite important, how to weave, how to grow the land, how to herd animals, how to embroider. So all these very complex skills are developed from a very early age. The other thing is that the family becomes very important, because kinship is how families reproduce their livelihoods. No? And so in order to keep control of how the families reproduce in a community, gender roles and the control of sexuality of women in particular become an important part of how they raise their children. No? And so we have this, again, this tension between a very tight control on their identities, on their sexuality, on their marriage, but at the same time, because they are productive and contribute to the economies in their families, they also have some sense of importance in the family. They take part in decision-making processes. I have seen discussions, and I will tell you a couple of stories right after these, you know. And as soon as they begin to contribute to the family economy, be it by working as an adult would or by bringing money, they become important members of the family, and their decisions are also respected. I'll talk to you about this guy. He was 14 when I took this photo with my phone. It's not a good photo, but and he lives in Cusco, high up in the Andes, in a community in Ocongate, 4,000 meters above the sea level. And he decided that he wanted money to buy a pair of boots and jeans and a bicycle. And so he quit school. And his parents respected his decision, and he went to Cusco to work in tourism. He joined these guys called porteadores who help tourists to carry their luggage in the way to Machu Picchu. He also worked in a factory, in a brick factory, that is a very common kind of employment for children in many areas in Peru, and then came back with his boots and his jeans. And he was very pleased and very proud of having done that. And the teacher was good because the teacher allowed him to come back to school. He had missed 2 months of school so that he didn't lose the year. No? What was really striking to me was the respect that he had in his family. The teacher wasn't that happy, but they also respected this decision. Now, it was an autonomous economic decision, and then he came back to the community. And in the case of this girl, she lived, she's probably, I don't know, like 10 years older than this. She was 16 at the moment. She lived in an island north of Peru, in the border between Peru and Ecuador, in an area called the Land of the Five Rivers. And she lives in an island between 2 of these rivers. And she felt locked in her community. And she wanted me to take her with me as a servant, because for many women in rural areas, domestic work is the only way out they have. And they try really hard to find relatives or people they know to leave their communities, because that's the only way they find to study high school. She only had a primary school because in her island, the school only got to 6th grade and there was no high school for girls like her. And she didn't want to marry. She didn't want to start having children at that age. And she just wanted a way out of her community. No? And the mother had told her, if you find someone who can take you from here, you can go. No? But until then, you have to stay. And so she was looking for her way out of her community. No? So what we see is that then living between these 2 worlds, having schooling, education, this protected adolescence as a promise, as a possibility, is enticing for many children. And at the same time, they are these independent beings in their community, self-sufficient in many ways, but trying at the same time to engage with this world outside and the promise of education for them. No? So I wanted to bring in these images and this reality of working children to think about different things that may relate to your experience working with children from different backgrounds and with so many different stories. The first one is to question or to think about our understanding of childhood as a universal thing. No? Of course, developmental psychology and neurology have taught us how the brain works, and we know now, and we have adapted education to that understanding of the role, and we create activities to stimulate the development of the brain and all the motor skills that we want in children. But we can think of how they still develop all these skills in other ways of raising children that we still have in our world today. And that those ways of raising children may also have consequences in the way in which children understand themselves and how they mature emotionally, or how independent they think they are, and also in the different relationships that we may find among communities that come from other backgrounds, where you can see on one hand that they are very rigid with values and allegiance to culture and heritage, and at the same time demanding on the children's responsibility. No? So this is a paradox that maybe you have found, and this can be an opportunity to think about this aspect, for example, how do we understand children? The other thing that I can also share with you as an immigrant mother is how growing up in a different culture can undermine the children's sense of loyalty or safety, security with their families. I have two children. We came from Peru when my daughter was 12 and my son was 7. And my son at 7 didn't rely on me for anything. He thought I knew nothing. And he relied to navigate the system here on his sister, no? Because she was older. She didn't have that issue with me because we were close and she was more mature, and she understood that I was a university professor, so I was not that vulnerable, let's say, or that far removed from the system here. But for my son, I knew nothing, and that undermined his respect for my authority at home. So we had to negotiate that. I had to negotiate that with him so that he had more respect for my authority, because I knew a few things, no? And so if you think, for example, on the role that many immigrant children have when they are the translators for their families, how their families are dealing with this situation of maintaining their authority and respect from their children. No? In some cases, this authority figure becomes the teacher or other friends in school that children look after for guidance and for some sense of security. No? These are a few things that I thought we could discuss, because it is a fact that in our world, we have now increasingly blurring borders between rural and urban life. Most of the world is urban now, even though rural areas are still important, but they are not that central in the organization of life for many people. So there is a lot of border crossing all the time. So blurring borders between rural and urban life in national and global scenarios. In the last 30 years, we have seen an enormous amount of people migrating, and not only from rural to urban areas, but also between rural to rural areas. Here in Europe, for example, there are thousands of Ecuadorians, Bolivians, and Peruvians from rural areas working south of Spain, replacing workers from Morocco, Tunis, Tunisia, in crops that are from the equator that are now being cultivated in Spain. And because of their expertise growing these fruits and vegetables, the Spanish government allowed the migration of rural workers in Spain. So you see rural cultures in rural areas in Spain. So we live in a very interesting world where all these events happen. You also have rural migration from many places in Latin America to rural areas in the States. No? So because of migration, there are multiple forms of contact between cultures that are not only possible, but almost unavoidable. And this creates clashes. No, the process of raising children is more complex now for Indigenous parents and their children. How to navigate these encounter of cultures, these different understandings of childhood. What does it mean to be protected or looked after or taken care of? How can you judge what your family does to you when you're treated in a different way than your classmates are treated? Is this, how can this be work through so that it is not a traumatic experience, no? Because where there are clashes of cultures, there is also an experience of violence and conflict, no? For many parents and communities to work to maintain the original identity becomes a very elaborate and demanding process, no? And even more so when children are trying to work around these identities, especially when they have to cross borders all the time, no? And this is what I had prepared to present, and I'm going to send you a list of resources that I would like you to watch or read or listen to for our next session in person that I am really looking forward to. Thank you.